Okay, so these past few months, I've been doing some research into Indigenous rights, and I've been focusing on current issues and discrepancies between United States policies and international policies. Today, I'd like to share some of the most relevant information that I found, analyze some existing policies, and also discuss what can be done to rectify current weaknesses of existing U.S. policies moving forward. Um, so before I start, I just like to preface my presentation by saying that I'm not personally affiliated with a tribe, and therefore I have a limited firsthand experience with these issues. I've taken special care to ensure that my resources are authored by, or at least in consultation with Native American authors. But I also encourage any Indigenous viewers to share their personal perspectives and experiences in the comments. So to kick things off, I'd like to delve into land rights. This is a very broad issue, so I will break it up into land rights around the effects of infrastructure projects on Indigenous land and land rights around the protection of sacred sites. So for infrastructure projects and their impacts on Indigenous land, these issues have become much more public in recent years due to the infringements of land rights happening during the approval and construction of pipelines. But these have also been happening, the violations of land rights have been happening for a much larger chunk of time. And at the root of these rights violations are historic policies which have limited tribal land ownership, such as forced relocation, the creation of reservations, and the Dawes Act. And the Dawes Act broke up tribal lands and sold nearly 100 million acres to non-Indigenous people. So the implications of that are that a lot of tribes currently do not legally own the land which is of historical importance or cultural significance to them. So that creates problems for legal recognition of their ability to regulate or impact policies and projects that are happening on that land, even though their sacred sites and cultural sites on that land are still protected under land rights in order to protect their culture. So one of the biggest concerns that tribes have expressed around infrastructure projects is the potential for contamination of water sources, and that's a risk which would exacerbate already abysmal reservation water conditions. And I'll discuss that more in depth later when I get into reservation conditions. Um, but there are also concerns around general destruction of the environment, and that's attributable to um, the Indigenous connection with the land, which is such a strong connection that the duty to protect land is a strong part of many tribal codes, which essentially means that it is a core tenet of an individual's tribal identity and tribal duty. So when we get into sacred sites, this duty to protect becomes even more important when sacred sites are at risk. In Ling versus the Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association, the U.S. Forest Service was allowed to build a road through what the Yurok, Carrick, and Talowa tribes considered to be the most sacred land. The court ruled that it was acceptable for the government to complete building this road, even though they acknowledged that this essentially would destroy the tribe's ability to practice their religion. They said that that would only be decreased spiritual fulfillment, and the federal government was not at fault for destroying the religion because there were no direct criminal sanctions being placed on practitioners. In the Navajo Nation versus the United States Forest Service, there wasn't quite the same level of destruction of sacred sites, but there certainly were still land rights violations that went unaddressed by courts. So this was a challenge against the use of human waste to create artificial snow on the San Francisco peaks, which the Navajo Nation deemed the holiest of shrines. And even though that this isn't quite a same level of destruction, the allowance of the creation of wastewater snow essentially prevents the tribe from upholding their culture, because the Navajo Nation Tribal Code explicitly calls for individuals to maintain the purity of these peaks. And what's also important to note about this case is that the creation of snow doesn't have to be done with human waste. So it would have been very easy to implement policy that did not violate Indigenous land rights and still provided the same benefit to the government and other communities. Okay, so then these issues have also been relevant in the recent pipeline projects. The Keystone Pipeline disrupted the Black Hills, and the Dakota Access Pipeline interfered with the Missouri River and Lake Oahe. All of those sites have spiritual importance to tribes. The Black Hills, and that is this right picture, already have a terrible history around respecting Indigenous land rights. They are of significance to the Lakota people, and the Lakota people own them, recognized by the United States government for a while, and then when white people discovered gold on the land, the Lakota people were forcefully removed. The government confiscated the land, which violated previous treaties, and then the government proceeded to create Mount Rushmore on the Black Hills, or on a mountain in the Black Hills, which is particularly ironic because they were memorializing white settlers who had disrupted Indigenous rights on an Indigenous sacred site. And the failure to honor Indigenous spiritual connections to land, and the failure for courts to uphold these rights, is reflective of a larger issue of a lack of respect for Indigenous religions. So one example of that is in the past there was a case where Indigenous people were prevented from using peyote in spiritual ceremonies, and then years later, when a Christian sect challenged the Controlled Substances Act because they used hallucinogenic tea in some of their practices and wanted that to be seen as legal, they were able to reverse the ruling, or not reverse the ruling of the peyote case, but they had a different outcome. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about some reservation conditions. I'm going to cover topics of healthcare, I'm going to talk about education, and I'm going to talk about water access. I'll revisit things around land rights when I talk about policy at the end of the presentation. Kick things off with education. So one of the biggest things around the history of Native education in the US is that it's often been used as an assimilation strategy in United States policies. So one saying that went along with that was "kill the Indian, save the man," which essentially meant that the United States wanted to use education to indoctrinate the children, to teach them white American culture, and essentially make them unlearn the historic culture of their people. And so the primary way that this was done was through the creation of Indian boarding schools. These were horrible locations for students. They almost always constituted physical, spiritual, emotional, and sexual abuse. They have since caused generational trauma, addiction, and things like difficulty preventing child abuse. So their effects are being felt today, even though throughout the 1900s, increased public awareness and outrage has resulted in the closure of nearly all boarding schools, decreased funding, decreased support, that sort of stuff. So around the current issues in education, the most important point to note is that Native Americans need to be in charge of educating their youth. And that's important so they can pass on their culture and their language through the education. And that's a right that comes with sovereignty and with the right to self-determination. And right now, the Indigenous education system is the same education system that non-Indigenous communities are being subject to. So that is not reflective of Indigenous needs. And Indigenous ideas of education are distinct from those typical to American education. One example of that is Indigenous ways of knowing. And so that's a broad idea that discusses Indigenous relationships with knowledge and how they differ from typical Western ways of knowledge. And so just a little bit of a discussion of what Indigenous ways of knowing constitutes. They incorporate different sources of knowledge, such as revelations through dreams and intuitions, and they also emphasize more than just human interaction, recognizing that knowledge also can come from relationships with things like plants and animals, and even objects that most non-Indigenous people might consider to be inanimate. And then there are also distinct Native values in education, and when they are able to implement their own education systems, these ideas are able, the ideas of Indigenous ways of knowing are able to come out, and they're also able to affirm the importance of other values such as tribal identity and collective support for each other. Okay, so next, healthcare. In Indian country, healthcare access has been recognized as a right since the late 19th century under the Treaty of Fort Laramie. In the mid-20th century, the federal law expanded this and created the Indian Health Service, which was responsible for ensuring the best possible health to Native Americans. And the policy also stated that all resources necessary were supposed to be devoted in order to meet that end. And although that's the policy, the Indian Health Service budget is very slim compared to the needs that the service needs in order to meet their responsibilities to the Indigenous community. And so even though the agency operates nearly 50 hospitals and more than 200 clinics, accessibility is a huge issue. And so that is, of course, related to the lack of budget. And the biggest implication of that is, of the slim budget, is the ability to offer competitive salaries for potential employees. And so that affects employment numbers and also the types of employees that they can find. And so the service has to contract out a lot of their specialty care, which further strains the budget, and it forces the health service, the combination of employment and budget constraints, forces the health service to prioritize cases. So they end up having to dismiss less life-threatening cases in order to take care of more urgent procedures. But that has implications such as preventable conditions aren't being addressed adequately or being identified early enough, and then there are obviously impacts that has on the individual's future health, but that also impacts the future strain being put on the Indian health service system. The tight budget and limited staff has also brutal consequences on the quality of care. And so in my research, I was reading about people dying from delayed life-saving treatments. I read about people dying because there was a failure to perform standard diagnoses. I heard about babies being born on hospital bathroom floors and sanitation equipment that was broken and went unreplaced. In one hospital, these conditions were so bad that the federal government shut down the hospital, and for 7 months that community was without medical facilities. So during that time, obviously that community faced consequences. Several tribe members died. Babies were born in the ambulance because the nearest clinics were still too far away. So all around there are quite inadequate healthcare conditions in Indian country. So the last area of reservation conditions that I'm going to address today is water access. And water access on reservations resembles third world countries more than it does the rest of American society. And if they were indicated on the map, the reservations, most of the reservations would be this middle reddish orange color. So about 40 to 55% of the population on reservations has access to safe drinking water. So that is reflective of a problem with infrastructure around the water availability on reservations. Many houses lack facilities around sanitation, such as sinks and toilets and showers. There's also just a huge lack of access to water in general, and then oftentimes the water that is available is not safe to drink because of contamination. And so contaminants have included a wide range of things, including things like uranium and arsenic, but also things like fecal matter and disease-causing pathogens. And there have even been cases where the federal government is aware of this contamination. One that comes to mind was they were aware of uranium poisoning or uranium contamination happening from mining, but didn't let the tribe know for more than a decade. And these contaminants and the lack of sanitation facilities and other living conditions like houses on reservations are overcrowded at twice the rate as non-Indigenous houses throughout the country. So all these factors compound to create other consequences for tribes, such as health complications and diseases, developmental conditions, stuff like that. So there's a huge issue around protecting tribal water sources. I'm gonna talk about policy for a little bit now. Federal policy typically considers tribes as states for water right purposes, but federal policy also imposes strict criteria on tribes in order to implement policies like the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So much so that it's hard and nearly impossible for tribes to regulate bodies of water that are not entirely located within their reservation. So things like rivers and lakes that are located on a boundary of reservation, they can't be regulated to a stricter extent than the surrounding state is regulating them. And so that's problematic when reservations are lacking the sanitation facilities that might be available to other communities beyond the reservation. Another area where federal treatment of tribes is not equal to federal treatment of states when it comes to water protection is that the budget is extremely slim in how much the federal government is supporting water development in Indian country. And so when comparing the funding to tribes throughout the country to the least funded state, tribes only receive 1/3. So collectively, tribes only receive 1/3 of that state in federal water infrastructure budget. Furthermore, what's even more extreme, the government spends more than 100 times the indigenous water safety budget on international water development in third world countries. Okay, so next I'd like to move on to talking about some action items. So pretty much what can we do to address these issues and make some changes to how Indigenous rights are recognized in the United States moving forward. So first thing is going to be policy changes. I looked at the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in order to understand how international policy sort of declares what Indigenous rights constitutes. And so this declaration was approved by the United Nations in 2007. The United States initially was in opposition of it in 2010, so 3 years later, the government said that they would lend their support to the declaration. There hasn't been a whole lot of follow through on that end. Not very much policy changes happened to reflect this additional support. But I will get into discussing a few articles that I have identified as being most applicable to these issues. So Article 12 is about the protection of land access to religious cultural sites. This is important for things like land rights claims. Article 14 details Indigenous right to education, affirming that Indigenous tribes are entitled to educate their own youth and that this is a core aspect of sovereignty and self-determination. Article 19 calls for free, prior, and informed consent, and this is before any government adoption or implementation of policies that impact tribes. And this is seen as the cornerstone of the declaration by a lot of people. So I'll discuss it a little bit more shortly and go into a little bit more depth into how this would differ from current US policy. Articles 29 and 32 are about land rights. 29 discusses conservation and 32 is about land use and the approval of projects affecting Indigenous land use. So again, that's going to be most applicable of the things that I have, the issues that I've brought up to land use, but also some things like reservation conditions, specifically around water usage. Article 37 calls for the recognition and enforcement of historic treaties and constructive agreements. And so that's going to come into play with issues around failures of current US policy to meet historical responsibilities of things like healthcare and water access. And what's important is not necessarily that the United States becomes a signatory of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or enacts these policies with the exact same wording. What's important is that the United States takes steps to embody these principles in policy. So I'll first look into how that can be done with the idea of consultation versus consent. Right now, policies in the US are built around consultation. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples calls for free, prior, and informed consent, which empowers tribes in their ability to protect their own rights. And it's also a core part of sovereignty and self-determination. The current consultation policies, on the other hand, are things like Executive Order 13,007, Executive Order 17,175, and the National Historic Preservation Act. And those call for consultation with Indigenous peoples prior to giving agencies the permission to take action, but they are not as strict as the consent regulations around free, prior, and informed consent, because in their implementation, they have proven quite ineffective because agencies just view this as a procedural step, and there's no obligation to follow through on Indigenous input. Conversely, free, prior, and informed consent ensures that tribes have power over relevant actions due to the prior and consent aspects of free, prior, and informed consent. The free and informed parts of it exist more to ensure that that consent's being given under just circumstances. Implementing a policy like free, prior, and informed consent in the United States can help transition to a partnership with tribes in promoting their best interests rather than a one-sided relationship where the United States government is dominating over tribal freedom and rights. And this is incredibly important. This idea of cooperation is incredibly important because historically the relationship has been characterized as a trust relationship, which is typical to countries and their sovereign indigenous nations throughout the world. But in the United States, it's been characterized as similar to that of a ward and a guardian. And so what that's meant is that the government has been allowed to violate indigenous treaties, indigenous rights in courts, so long as they were able to claim that they are acting in tribes' best interest, even if tribes were questioning the motivations of the federal government or disagreed that what was being done was actually in their best interest. For more understanding into free, prior, and informed consent, I encourage you to read through this little infographic by Pueblo Action Alliance, and it just goes into a little bit more depth into what free, prior, and informed consent entails and what it means. In the meantime, I'll get into Indigenous law. And so Indian law jurisprudence is theoretically supposed to implement the Indian law canons of construction, which call for generous interpretations of policies when they're being applied to Native Americans. In my research, I have seen everything but that, especially around things like religious freedom applications to Indigenous peoples versus the same application to Christian practitioners. And in order for any policies that I'm discussing to be legally effective and to be enforceable in courts, the legal system has to reverse its historical trends of anti-Indian discrimination. That also includes things like incorporating Indigenous perspectives into legal interpretations so that there is not interpretation discrimination based on Indigenous beliefs versus non-Indigenous beliefs. Another thing I'd like to talk about, this will be the last thing in regards to policy changes, is the need to support Native American economies. So right now, economic conditions currently heavily impede efforts to improve reservation conditions independent from government funding. And so when the government funding is inadequate to support things like the educational desires of Indigenous populations or water infrastructure, the healthcare that I talked about, the Indigenous people have to rely on their own economies to support those priorities. And right now, there are federal policies that are responsible for a lot of Indigenous policy, and those need to be changed. For example, states are allowed to tax reservation economic activity, but don't have to give proportional services back to the community. So a lot of reservations are being forced to pay large sums of money through taxation to the surrounding states, but aren't getting the same level of resources being given back to them in terms of services. And states also have a lot of control over on-reservation economic development, such as when a tribe wants to open a casino, states have the ultimate decision in that. They get the last say, which is not only a violation of Indian sovereignty, it also certainly hinders the independent economic development of American Indians and their ability to support themselves in the future. There are also federal policies that restrict things like economic development strategies. Tribals have more restrictions around the use of loans. The Indian tax laws also make it essentially, it's not illegal to, but it's essentially ineffective to tax on-reservation economic activity. Tribal governments have it's ineffective when tribal governments try to do that. So next I'll talk about some action items for social workers. And so when it comes to the policy that I've just discussed, social workers have a crucial role to play. They can participate in policy design, they can participate in advocacy and in implementation. So when we talk about advocacy, that is about not only advocating to political authorities that have policymaking power, but it's also about advocating to the community and making sure there's community support for policies, especially in non-Indigenous communities. When it comes to implementation, social workers can impact how policies are implemented, not only through their participation in policy design, but also in their role that they can play in the actual implementation of policies. So when we're talking about policy design, they can make sure that the policies are going to be easy to implement effectively and make it so that there is a clear direction to go in implementation. When working individually with Indigenous populations, social workers should be especially careful to use a strengths-based approach and a target-centered approach. And so that is incredibly important for affirming Native values and belief systems, things like Native ways of knowing and Native sovereignty. And doing so is not only imperative to supporting Indigenous rights, it's also useful for ensuring that social workers are putting their effort and their resources into use as effectively and as efficiently as possible. Social workers also have a role to play in community revitalization, and so what I mean by that is things like changing the education system and changing the healthcare system to better support the community goals and community values. And in that, social workers are going to be required to fulfill duties that they already are fulfilling, but to a larger extent, and that will be things like education and healthcare social work, and also things like assisting transitions of families that are going to employment that might take shape around things like childcare and access to jobs. Social workers also can help families that are struggling with issues that are currently of importance with Indigenous communities. A lot of Indigenous communities struggle with problems at higher rates than other populations in the country. Things like addiction and foster care, high suicide rates, historical trauma, and then also the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So to wrap things up, I'm going to talk about some collective action steps that anybody can take. You don't have to be a politician or a social worker to do this stuff. You don't have to be well versed in Indigenous knowledge or issues in order to start doing this stuff. The first thing that I will talk about, which I think is incredibly important, is amplifying Indigenous voices. So that is talking about things like broadening the reach of Indigenous voices, of Indigenous leaders, Indigenous activists, and just other people that represent that community through things like social media. You should also be taking your time to educate yourself on these issues, on the issues that I discussed here, on other issues that Indigenous leaders are talking about, in order to understand them better, and so that you are not relying on Indigenous people to educate you for you. You can show up to support Indigenous goals in protests, but when you do this, you have to recognize that they have priorities that might be distinct from your own, and understand ideas of tribal sovereignty. And when you are protesting with them, protesting in support of them, you need to internalize these values, these goals. Over the past few years, there's been a lot of support for the effectiveness of protests for Indigenous rights, things around the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Standing Rock protests. They were able to increase a lot of media attention, have some policy reviews, things like that. Going forward, there's definitely still a need for protests in order to bring awareness to and bring change around policy. And increased public support can help minimize the brutality that Native American protesters have previously experienced, such as during the Standing Rock protests. Anyone can also support policies. When legislative bodies are considering new policies, you can research how they will affect Indigenous peoples. You can research what Indigenous people are currently saying about these policies, and then you can use that knowledge to pressure representatives into affirming Indigenous rights. If there are policies that are limiting Indigenous rights, then reach out to your representatives over the phone, through an email, through social media, and tell them not to support it. If there are policies which will extend Indigenous rights to better reflect things that are articulated in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, then you should urge your politicians to support and pass that legislation. Okay, and as my final thing, I am going to do a little bit of a question and answer. I came up with these questions, so they might not be anything that you are particularly wondering, but first one, I would like to talk about, what's the best next step for Indigenous rights policies in the United States. And typically I defer this to Indigenous leaders because my research here did not comprehensively address Indigenous rights on all fronts. But with my perspective and just talking about the issues that I've just discussed, I think adopting the Declaration on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People would be a great next step for having a direct path to sweeping and meaningful change. Smaller policy goals, though, that could also be good next steps include incorporation of free, prior, and informed consent specifically into U.S. policies, or things like addressing the lack of resources being given to tribes to support existing policies. Second question, are there any resources you recommend for learning about Indigenous history or experiences? So these two books that I've put here were my favorite resources before starting this project. They both helped me understand the new knowledge that I gained while doing research for this project, and I certainly highly recommend them to anybody that wants to better understand Indigenous history or Indigenous perspectives and currently do not have much background. I'd also say that you should follow Indigenous voices on social media. Two accounts that I have found as an excellent way to stay up to date with Indigenous issues and perspectives are Rise Indigenous and Ceding Sovereignty. The last question is, what was the most surprising thing you learned while doing research? This is certainly a tough question because I definitely learned a lot, and a lot of it was surprising. I think that after a lot of thought, I think that the most surprising was probably the conditions of water access on reservations and how different they are than what I'm used to, and how similar they are to third world countries. I also think that perhaps the most frustrating thing that I learned was how anti-Indian courts have been in their interpretations of existing policies and historical agreements and things like that. All right, so here are some information sources. If you are interested in learning more about these issues, I encourage you to do your own research. You can take a look at these sources to understand more of what I'm talking about, but I also encourage you to do your own research into Indigenous rights to better understand it more than what I could present here or what these sources cover.